Hello, I'm Sanford Grover, sometimes called Sandy. I've been associated with the Horseless Carriage Club of America for about 56 years. 56 years of the most important and happiest days of my life. I asked myself, how did I ever get tuned in on old cars? I think it started when I was a youngster. I always had a real keen fascination for automobiles. I marveled at the cars as I would walk down the street back in the 20s, and some of them were, of course, earlier vintage than that, and the designs and the different makes just kind of intrigued me. Other than that, one day in Madeira, where we used to live, I saw a 1923 Maxwell Touring parked on the curb at a used car lot in Madeira. I asked the used car lot manager about the car, and it was his, and he also was a member of the Central California regional group in Fresno, and invited me to come down to the next meeting. And I gladly accepted that, and I thought that was a great move on my part, certainly, for me personally, because I became instantly enthused and enamored at the extent to which these members were taking and restoring old automobiles. We met once a month. I commuted from Madeira to Fresno each month like that, and enjoyed the camaraderie of the membership. I found that they were so very helpful, willing, and always generous of their time and information about the old car restorations. We went for rides, and we went on tours and so on before I even owned a car for the club. My first car that I owned after joining the club was a 22 Ford Coupe. I found it in Fresno on a driveway. I went up and rang the doorbell and asked him if it was for sale. The car had 4 flat tires and a dead battery. I says, I'll offer you $100 for it. And he thought that was fair, so I gave him the $100, and I got a hand pump and pumped up the tires. We took the battery over to the standard station and gave it a quick charge, and I drove it home to Madeira, 20 miles, up Highway 99 with my wife Jane in tow, just in case I needed any help or off-road assistance. That was my first experience. I eventually sold the car, and unfortunately the guy that bought it should not have towed the car per se because of the transmission problems when you're towing a Model T. He found out when he got to Bakersfield that he didn't have any transmission left. So anyway, from there, I was fascinated with the rest of the organization, the national part of it. And we began going to conventions and went on some of the local tours with the Central California bunch. And I got acquainted with some of the board members and some of the older members of the HCCA, vintage probably 1930s and 40s variety. I knew Everett Wellington and also Bud Catlett, E.C. Bill Lawrence, Bill Hara, a few others, and got well acquainted with these people. Went to swap meets and had a great time scrounging the foothills of Madera County, picking up parts and taking them to swap meets and getting further acquainted with fellow horses carriage people. That's where I got enough money to put my first car together, a 15 Ford, which I found out in Eastern California, near Fresno. My wife, when she first saw it, as I towed it on a trailer into the backyard of our house there in Madera, she wondered what on earth had come over me. And well, I felt the same way almost. But it was in such shambles, a total rust job, about ready to be ground into the dirt. But I resurrected it, and about 4 years later, it was like brand new. The members of the Central California group helped me a tremendous amount of times, disassembling and working over the engine, the framework, the bodywork. I picked up a kit of hardware, hickory framework for a 15 Model T. It was Northern California swap meet in Sacramento. And that was the start of the rebuild of the structure of this 15 Ford I had. After it was finished, I toured it for 16 years. We went up to Tenaya Lake in Yosemite Park. We went to Mount Hood Park out of Portland on the Portland tour of 1971. We did tours all over the Gold Country between Mariposa and Sacramento and points north. We had a great time with that car. I finally sold it to my daughter and her husband, who toured further with it for 5 more years. Eventually it went to the museum in Arizona. Look at the town down there. It's near Phoenix, but it's still in the museum as far as I know. But it was strictly 15, engine number so-and-so, and all the parts that were applied and found on the original car. I ran for the board in 1961, and I didn't win election that time, but I was runner-up, and it so happened that Don Coley, who was on the board at the time, had intended to resign his seat, and the next move was that they appointed me to succeed his term. And so that carried me into 1962, 3 and 4. Then I ran again, another term. And during those years, I had various assignments as on different committees. And also concurrent with that time, I wrote for about 8 years for the Gazette, the column called Regional Highlights, with Sanger's cartoon of the stray dog in the mailbox and so on, and the rattlesnake at the foot of the post. But anyway, that was Ed Prager's cartoon. Fred Hayward was editor all that time, and we had a great time getting material ready for the Gazette through the 60s and into 70s. And then later on, I was elected as secretary of the National in 1963, or 1964, I guess it was. And the next year I was elected treasurer, and the following year I was elected president, skipping vice president. Mr. Sorensen, who should have been the vice president and elected president, declined to run for president that year, so I stepped into his particular succession. So that's how I eventually became president of the National, and have been grateful ever since for that opportunity and privilege. That was such a great experience for me. I made a point of trying to see as many and visit as many regional groups as I could during that particular year, visiting groups from San Francisco, Santa Rosa, even in New Zealand. We took a trip over to New Zealand one time, and I was able to meet with the New Zealand club while there at the Najwicks and so on. That was really an outstanding experience and privilege to be among those wonderful people there in New Zealand. I would say too that in the future I would still think that would be one of the top priorities of any president of the HCCA, to visit as many regionals as they can. The personal touch, the personal appearance, it tends to enthuse the groups, not because of the person doing it, but the fact that the office took the time to travel to their meeting. Since then I've been on numerous national tours. I've had other cars like the 1909 Sears auto buggy, a 1910 Cadillac Touring, a 1908 Maxwell touring car, which we also toured for about 16 years, and also the 1903 Knox that originally was found and restored by not Fred Hayward, but the Gazette editor. I shouldn't have missed that man's name for the moment. A senior moment, no less. But anyway, I wound up with the 1903 Knox. I took it on one tour down the coast on the 17-mile drive, and it went about 15 miles an hour. As I was traveling south on the coast, I noticed that some cars were already coming back from the lunch stop down below for about another 20 miles. Well, I decided, well, I'll never make that, so I turned around and went back to tour headquarters in Monterey without any lunch. But anyway, it was a bear to crank. Oh, geez. It had a crank about 3.5 feet long, and even with the compression thing turned on, it was still difficult to crank that bugger. But anyway, it was a pretty good car, but not very practical. I sold it to eventually to Con, what's his name? Yeah, I eventually sold it to Con Fletcher, and I thought to myself, gee, he's got the build that needs to be the man that cranks his car. I was just half happy to see it roll out of my driveway, but I'm sure he has done a great deal with it. I think he took the heavy body off and put a roadster body on it, and I'm sure it's back on the road again. Bill, do you have any questions that I could answer? During the time I was a member of the Central South California Regional, and then later in helping to organize the Sonora Regional Group up here in Sonora in 1972, I was very, very much aware of the glory of wearing costumes on the tour. I know it's a lot of work, a lot of extra baggage, and in these days it means an extra suitcase on the airplane, probably. But nonetheless, you know, Bill Harrah, when he ran his tours, costuming was mandatory. You didn't see anything like encouraged or recommended or something like that. It was required, and everybody understood that. And I think it added a great deal to the significance and the great attraction for the public to see people in their costumes. You know, even today, those who do costume, I noticed that the public wants to come up to them and say they want their picture taken with you, with your car, just because you're wearing a costume. I think that's pretty indicative of the importance of wearing period clothes commensurate with the year of your car. But I'm still a heavy believer in wearing the costumes on, especially national tours. We're out there in the public, and if we want more membership, I think that's part of the big answer to attract people in that manner. Today, you hardly see any costumes. It kind of leaves a sad feeling in my heart about that. The people are still just as wonderful, but it's just going that extra mile, that extra trouble. But I tell you, you get the feeling of playing the part and dressing like they used to, commensurate with the year of the car you're driving. I think that's a very important point, that to increase membership, I think that's one of the best ways of doing it. I don't think we had any problem getting members in the older days, but now we keep on hearing us to urge us to bring in new members. Well, true, we aren't an old clothes club, as I've heard some comment, but if they don't really feel the part, that's okay. That's their business. But gee, I think they're losing a great deal by not getting into their suits and their gowns and so on and playing the part. I think the cars are getting fewer and fewer to find, I guess, but I think if you still work at it, you can still find them. I keep hearing of leads, even though I'm out of the driving age at my point of age of 96. I would still like to go out there and hunt down cars in barns and garages and keep my ear tuned to the ground for leads. They're still there. So I'm sure the Horseless Carriage of America will continue to succeed because the personnel that they're getting on the boards are top people, and that's what it takes. You need intelligent and aggressive and eager people to keep the club going. And I think we're in good hands. I think the board people that I've seen in recent years have reflected exactly that. And I certainly wish them well. I'd like to extend this story about the HCCA to include that about the formation of the Sonora Regional Group. I was living in Madera at the time, but I used to come up weekends to see the farm that we bought and eventually moved to in 1977. Anyway, in the meantime, we began to recognize some of the people that lived up here. Marion and Joan Van Villeheisen, Johnny and Dorothy Robertson, later on Stu Laidlaw, and Joe Morris, all past presidents. We've had quite a nice run for our money up here at Sonora. Our first group was chartered in 1972 in December. Assisting us with that was Bob Campbell and also Dr. E.C. Lawrence, who were on the board at the time of our charter. And from that year on, from 1972, we staged our first major tour the next year, in 1973, coordinating our tour with the Central California group. And we did a good coverage of the Gold Country that particular time, and had a great turnout. I would say probably 60 or so or more people and cars. It was a great effort and a very successful beginning. Today we have celebrated our 40th anniversary as of November 2012, and we keep going. We have a smaller membership now. We used to have around 45 thereabouts. Now we have around 30, but we're still holding our own and still doing tours. And I think even we did a national tour back in 2010, I believe, out of Murphy's, the nearby town of Murphy's. Had a great turnout for that. But I think we've been able to contribute quite a bit to the horseless carriage and keeping the Gold Country alive with the older cars. We also had hooked up with bientennial tours with the Nevada group and the Gold Country group. The Gold Country from Nevada County, Grass Valley and Nevada City. And then we did some tours with the Carson City bunch, the Silver State Regional Group. So we've expanded our participation, and we're still in the game and going strong.